pequeño de personas que me ayudan a hacer eso nada más. Soy un distribuidor, por así decirlo. No vendo el menudeo, solo el por mayor.
Canada has had a major opioid crisis, overdose death crisis, to the point where during the pandemic, more people were dying from toxic drug overdose deaths than COVID. It's not being seized. And that's the thing is, you can say less than 1% of fentanyl is coming from Canada. Of course, none of it's being stopped. So the statistic is certainly skewed.
You can pay $40,000 and they'll just won't look at the container. It will basically be that container's going through. That's also happening in Canadian ports.
100%.
Boom! It's another episode of Crash Out, this time getting to a really great issue that's been underreported of the other border, like not the Mexico-US border, but the Canadian-US border, and what's happening out there. It's a crazy story. 5,500 mile border, that's 8,900 kilometer border, the biggest in the world, right in the north of the USA. And only 8% of the number of Border Patrol agents up there compared to down in Mexico. This has come in the news with President Donald Trump attacking Canada over fentanyl coming over the border. And really great to be here with Katarina Schultz, who's been really on this story before pretty much anyone else, or almost anyone else, and perhaps did the first ever interview with a Mexican cartel affiliate in Canada. So we've got a great report about this on the Crash Out website. And we're going to talk about this story and how Kat got into this. So first of all, I'm going to play a little clip of the interview. So it's an interview with a Sinaloa cartel affiliate in southern British Columbia. And then we'll get into all of the information. So here's the clip.
Sí, yo estoy en Canadá. Ya tengo 4 años aquí trabajando y me regreso a México a mediados del año. Ya de manera definitiva me retiro, por así decirlo, del trabajo. Como soy independiente, hago todo, por así decirlo, recojo las cosas, cuando me las mandan, verifico que todo esté bien y las entrego. Tengo un grupo pequeño de personas que me ayudan a hacer eso nada más. Soy un distribuidor, por así decirlo. No vendo el menudeo, solo el por mayor. Desde Sinaloa, pero entra por Estados Unidos. Un tiempo venía directo desde la Ciudad de México. Me regreso porque el tiempo de trabajo ya se cumplió. Ya tengo mucho tiempo aquí y se está poniendo un poco peligroso el tema porque están haciendo pastillas aquí ahora mismo y eso atrae más gobierno. Mandaron gente desde Sinaloa a hacerlo aquí, más cerca de los estados que las quieren hacer llegar. Y los asiáticos aquí consiguen los químicos. Muy bien, aquí el material me llega a 27-28. Sí, por lo que pasó en Culiacán, hace días los hermanos ocupan billetes porque se van a hacer garras con su tío. Y pues abrieron la llave de eso.
So yeah, this is an amazing story and a really undercovered story.
It is, it's a big one.
Yeah, totally. So just tell me a little bit about yourself, how you got into covering some of the narco journalism and how you got particularly into the Canadian narco story.
So you and I actually have a pretty similar story, right? And I've always wanted to cover international news, of course, with speaking Spanish and understanding a lot of the context of Mexico because of the proximity to Canada, where I'm from. It just kind of came naturally. Now, when I came down here and I started covering politics, health, immigration, of course, the organized crime and the cartels plays a role in all of those aspects and all of those topics. So then I got into that sort of the cartel girl reporter role and started to realize just how entrenched these organized crime groups are in all 3 countries, Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And sure enough, not a lot of people who are covering this beat, were really focusing on Canada. And I got into this after Trump's first administration. So what that meant was we were seeing the fallout in Canada of the Canadian federal government having rescinded the visa requirement for Mexican nationals traveling to Canada, and also the fallout of Trump cracking down on the southern border and leaving the northern border completely unprotected, which meant this made it very simple in a way for Mexican cartel members and affiliates to go to Canada, move operations up there, and really operate under the radar. So for them, it was honestly a no-brainer, especially with the way they're functioning like a Fortune 500 business. Okay, if we can traffic into the United States through a massive undetected border, we can get our guys up there without a visa requirement. They could practically legally get into that country, whether that's through student visa, tourist visa, or refugee status, which has become, or was for a while since 2016, pretty common. We can create this syndicate of cartel affiliates in North America, the furthest northern country, and traffic and produce fentanyl, which at the time, especially particularly during COVID, was killing people at an extreme level in Canada and the United States. And they could make this work at such a high level that wasn't happening in Mexico and certainly wasn't happening in the United States. And so keeping in mind that at the same time this is all happening, that they're moving operations to Canada, the Canadian economy was failing slowly but surely. And so they could also hire a lot of Canadians who were looking for some extra cash, even if they had never participated in organized crime or any type of crime previously, to drive really undetected from Canada into the United States and move product for them and make a little extra cash.
Just to rewind a bit.
Yeah.
You grew up in Vancouver, yeah?
I did.
What's the general drug and crime scene like in Canada? Like, what kind of drugs? A lot of people taking drugs. What are they? What kind of local Canadian gangs and gangsters are there?
So Canada has had a major opioid crisis, overdose death crisis, to the point where during the pandemic, more people were dying from toxic drug overdose deaths than COVID. And Vancouver is, in a way, ground zero. I mean, we have notoriously East Hastings Street, which is like Skid Row. You have an extreme level of drug addiction and homelessness and mental health crisis on that street, and it's through the downtown core. And so really, Vancouver became the perfect hub because you also already had so many local gangs operating. And now Vancouver particularly has always had this sort of gang problem. And we see every couple of years when the territory or the power dynamics shift, there's all these shootouts or people dying and broad daylight murders. I mean, we had one happen not just a few years ago at Vancouver International Airport, and it created this whole news story, because how are you going to have a broad daylight shooting in Vancouver? I mean, we see that happening in Culiacan, right? But then you never really think a major urban city in Canada is going to see a broad daylight shooting at the international airport. And so we have multiple gangs there that are also now affiliated with the cartel. We have, of course, the Hells Angels, which is across the country. We have Brothers Keepers, United Nations, Red Scorpion. And these gangs are typically divided by ethnicity and ethnic backgrounds. And this is because of, like, of course, the widespread historical immigration that's happened in Canada. And so, you'll have a lot of South Asian, Indian people, and then Middle Eastern people, a lot of people from Iran, and then Asian syndicates, which would include Chinese people, Vietnamese people. And what ended up happening was these gangs for so long were controlling the guns and drug trade within Canada and internationally. And they started becoming affiliated with the Mexican drug cartels. Of course, when these Mexican drug cartels just 10 years ago decided we're going to move operations into Canada, a major selling point for them was also we're going to associate with the local gangs and everyone's going to get a piece of the pie and everything's going to be homegrown. So when you already have these homegrown gangs that control the drug trade within Canada and internationally, it made it so easy for these guys from Mexico to go over there. Hey, nice to meet you. Let's work together and we're all going to make a lot more money. And we already had fentanyl precursors coming in from China. And just through the simple fact that we have such a huge Chinese population, it only made sense. And you have the port of Vancouver. So for these guys to come in and associate with these gangs, it essentially created this cross-country business that it just fell into their lap. It was so easy to navigate the drug trade in Canada for these guys once they associated with these gangs that were already existing.
So before they got really big into the fentanyl thing in Canada, they were into cocaine. Yeah, the Mexican cartels were taking cocaine up to Canada. Do you know how that was traveling there? Was that going through the United States or on planes or on boats, or how were they taking it there?
So for a lot of it, it was boats. Of course, there was still trafficking through the United States, but because of that, of Vancouver being a major port city, there were and still are seizures at the port where you have these big, what do you call
Containers.
the containers, yeah, the shipment containers with drugs and guns. And so it made it fairly simple. And then also just people illegally crossing into Canada, not through legitimate border crossings, because like we say, there's so much unprotected border. So, and then through planes, certainly, of course, because even my source within CBSA, the Canadian immigration, told me that there are so many authorities within levels of immigration, whether that's in Asia, the United States, Mexico, and Canada, that are on a payroll and understanding which flights, which cars, which boats are going to be coming in with the shipment. So let's turn away and let that pass through. And also a lot of the time what happens in Canada is...
Sorry, really, so basically this is what happens in Mexican ports, where people say you can pay $40,000 and they'll just won't look at the container. You know, it will basically be that container's going through. That's also happening in Canadian ports.
100%. And you can even see it, like, for example, we have this Canadian border show, right? Where it shows what's going on and then they're stopping people, like a reality show. And a lot of the time, most of the seizures that are reported, and also they show it in the show all the time, they're seizing these large shipments of cat, which is like coming from Asia, or hashish. And why are they seizing that? Because at the same time that those illegal substances are coming in, you've got this huge shipment of fentanyl that's coming in that's going completely undetected, because all the focus has shipped to the shipment that they don't really give a fuck about. It's that smoke screen shipment, right? So
they had the trafficking network set up.
Yep.
Just a quick question about the cocaine. I mean, is there a crack market in Canada, or is it more just like powder cocaine, partiers? What's the kind of...
For the longest time, there was a huge crack market in Canada. That entirely shifted to fentanyl, meth, and heroin. Now, it's basically purely fentanyl. When I did that report in the summer where I talked to the Sinaloa Cartel affiliate, at the same time, I went to East Hastings because it's very important for me to talk to the people who are living this. You know, who is consuming and what are they seeing? What has changed? Because this is their day-to-day. And when I spoke to multiple people, whether they were just people who are unfortunately living on the street and are in the complete throes of drug addiction, or people who are also advocates for this community, what I heard time and time again was, we can't get heroin here. And meth, yeah, but everyone's doing fentanyl. It's all fentanyl, it's all benzos. And I thought that was interesting, because that basically meant that the Canadian market, and we see this not just in Vancouver and BC, we see this in Alberta too. Alberta at one point was ground zero for fentanyl overdose crisis. I mean, there was this video that went viral of two parents parked in a Walmart parking lot. They had a toddler in the back seat, and they're completely, hunched over, just strung out on fentanyl. And of course, in the East Coast too, in Ontario, it's a big problem. Certainly, cocaine is also massive, especially in these main urban cities, whether it's Montreal, Vancouver, Toronto, party cities. You'll see cocaine everywhere, and most people who are out drinking are also doing cocaine. And pink cocaine, the designer drug 2C, became also very popular in Vancouver pretty recently, and you hear about it in the rap songs too. So of course that's going to be pushed even more. But even when I'm in Vancouver, of course, I'm a young woman. I'm going to go out and party. I don't touch the drugs, but I'll walk into a bathroom at a bar and there's just like a communal coke mountain for everyone. You just cut your line and do a bump.
Just stuck in there in the bar. That's crazy.
Literally, it's
That's
insane.
great.
And cocaine is huge over there. But for most of the sort of street drugs, I mean, they're all street drugs, right? But for people who are really suffering with addiction, it's basically just fentanyl. And people even told me, I wish I could do heroin again. I don't want to be doing fentanyl. I want to go back to heroin. It wasn't the same. My body operated better. You can't find heroin. You try to go find heroin, they're going to sell you heroin. It's fentanyl.
So basically, Canada is the number 2 in the world itself for this fentanyl problem.
Yeah.
And Vancouver, Toronto, you've got the same issues like you have in San Francisco of just like people taking drugs on the street.
And a lot of open use because
strung out on dope. And
it's
just
been
like,
decriminalized.
And a lot of people dying. I mean, it's like more than 50,000 apparent opioid deaths, I think the phrase, since about 2017 or so.
It's extreme, and to the point where the Canadian government and the provincial governments have even they've tried so many different approaches to it. I remember when I was first starting out in journalism, I did a report on this button that they were placing in SROs, which are single room occupancy hotels, where a lot of people live. You kind of pay like day to day. It's kind of like a motel, but different. And those are places where most people who are doing hard drugs daily are staying and using. And so they were putting these buttons, they were like panic buttons in the room so that if you felt like you were about to overdose or if you were using with someone who was overdosing, you press this button and emergency services would just show up right away. It got to the point where the Canadian government was like, okay, we know that people are doing drugs. We know that people are dying from fentanyl. Please don't use alone. Go ahead, do your drugs. But don't do drugs alone because everyone is dying. And that was super problematic. And then it got to the point where they decriminalized use. So especially in Vancouver, you can be waiting at the bus stop and then you get on the bus and someone is, shooting up or smoking a pipe completely open. And those videos go viral a lot too. And to a point, it is quite dehumanizing. But at the same time, I also understand the frustrations of people in the community who say, oh my God, open drug use has just become so normal. And we have like the safe consumption sites too, which is how it's an extreme problem if they're opening up basically community centers for people to go in and use their drugs because so many people are dying.
So yeah, that gets into the harm reduction debate versus the kind of harder line approach, law enforcement
Which
debate.
I don't have a stand on. I mean, you and I talk about this.
Yeah.
This is not our job and it's not the topic. The point is it's gotten to a point where this has become a debate, which just shows the level of the crisis, essentially.
Yeah. Now, with the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel also operating in Canada.
Yep.
What did you learn about the way they've set up these networks? I mean, these are people which seem quite close to the leaders. They're people who are quite close to the Chapitos or to El Mencho's inner circle in Jalisco, and how they're operating with the Canadian gangs. Are they kind of place themselves above them and selling to them, or how is this working?
This is where it gets a little bit complicated because the problem with also the way the Canadian government or law enforcement will report on this is, for example, that story that just came out where those 3 guys, their assets are being frozen in Surrey in British Columbia. And it was said that they were operating directly with El Mayo, like talking to him. It's interesting because what I would like to know is, okay, what gang are these three guys a part of? And the Canadian government and reporting will never announce that. I mean, most of the time, they will never actually say which cartels are operating in Canada, which gangs are associating with the cartels. Any of that information is, I'm getting that firsthand from the guys that are literally doing the work and are willing to share. And from what I can tell, it's a pretty even playing field in a way. And I can understand why. And I can also understand why a lot of people would say, these Canadian guys are not at an even playing field operating with El Mayo.
I wonder, and I'll have to look at the paperwork of that case exactly, but I'm wondering when they say they're buying directly from El Mayo, if they mean they're buying from a representative
For sure.
of El Mayo, rather than El Mayo
Himself.
like talking with some guys in Canada, you know, but somebody who says, I represent El Mayo's
Mayo?
interests and I'll sell you, you know, his dope, something like that. I wonder if that's more the case.
Totally. But at the same time, I do think that especially like these three guys, for example, are very high up in that hierarchy because the Sinaloa cartel is obviously certainly profiting off of that Canadian consumer. So if you have these three guys who are like, yeah, let's go hard, let's bring in all the drugs, we have no fear, let's do these huge shipments of cocaine and sell it in Vancouver, where there's a huge, lots of thirsty noses in Vancouver, they're going to see that as this is a huge market and a lot of profit to be made. So I don't see it as like, okay, the top guys of the Sinaloa cartel that are associating with these three Canadians, they're just like bottom of the barrel losers, because I think they are making a lot of money and they are trafficking a significant amount.
Now, we've got the Canadian market, but then they're also feeding the US
American
market from Canada, particularly the Northwest United States, but also the Northeast. And it's a big way which compensates for crackdowns in Mexico. Now, this came up as a political issue with President Trump saying, you know, the Canadians are letting fentanyl come over, we're going to put tariffs, and it gets a big political issue. Also then with Donald Trump saying, oh, I kind of like Canada, that'd be a nice new state.
Yeah,
you know,
51st state.
We're going to make it a 51st state. So you get a very big, very charged political issue here. Now, the Canadians, they came back on one side saying, actually, there's very little fentanyl coming over.
Less than 1%.
Yeah, if you look at what's seized by Customs and Border Patrol in the US, 99% of it is on the Mexican border and like less than 1% on the US border. But is that stuff being seized really all that's coming over? Or is something different happening?
It's not being seized. And that's the thing is, you can say less than 1% of fentanyl is coming from Canada. Of course, none of it's being stopped. So the statistic is certainly skewed.
So you're watching this video and you're really into this world of cartels and organized crime and drugs. If you want to find out more about this, then go to www.crashoutmedia.com. For completely free, you can subscribe and see these great reportage, analysis and breaking news. Or if you like this, then for $5, the price for a couple of cups of coffee, you can get full access and become part of the Crash Out community. Now back to the video.
Certainly skewed. And the thing is, prior to Trump getting into office in January, it was quite rare to hear about these massive seizures. Trump came into office, he cracked down, he said 51st state, the tariff threats, then the tariffs actually happened. And then every week, multiple times a week, I'm seeing so many seizures. RCMP, CSIS, CBSA is constantly putting out reports of the largest seizure in Canadian history, the largest drug lab bust in Canadian history. You're telling me that just appeared out of the blue? And that, of course, if these are these massive seizures, imagine what's going undetected, and imagine that's certainly not less than 1% of fentanyl. And you know what? Even if it is less than 1% of fentanyl, let's just give the benefit of the doubt, right? How much fentanyl makes up that percentage? It's enough to kill a lot of people, okay? It's still a lot of hard drugs, and it's still being trafficked from Canada. And this is something very frustrating for me, particularly because when I did this story and I reached out to Canadian authorities and I said, hey, can we talk about the fentanyl production by the Mexican cartels in Canada that's being produced domestically and trafficked internationally? Oh, Katerina, if that was happening, we would know, and it's certainly not at a large scale. What kind of fucking answer is that? Because then I interview the very guy in charge of it, and then I get invited to go to the lab and to see where production is happening, and they're telling me exactly how it's being produced, how it's being trafficked, how it's being dealt.
So now, so I think this is a really important point. So the Canadian-US border is very different from the Mexican-US border.
Yeah.
Because first, it's almost 3 times as long. So the Mexican-US border is 2,000 miles long, and the Canadian border is 5,500 miles long. As well as that, over 90% of the Border Patrol agents are on the US-Mexico border, because that's what all the migrants are also coming over,
Yeah.
which they're really looking for. Whereas you don't really have migrants coming from Canada in the same way, sneaking over. So whereas in Mexico, it's harder to take fentanyl between border posts, and most of it goes through what they call the ports of entry, through the official ports, and it's like a lot of it's body carriers, like people carrying it inside their body, inside their bodies, or people in vehicles and trapped vehicles with the drugs hidden inside the
car
vehicles.
panels.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas in Canada, you can just walk it over, and if you walk from Canada to the United States, what's the chance of being caught?
Probably like less than 1%.
Less than 1%, yeah. So they could just like, why? So they're saying, oh, we're only catching, 47 pounds of fentanyl going through the official crossings, but then everyone just doesn't need to take it through there. Why take it through, risk your car being searched if you can just walk over the Rockies into the United States?
It's also very important to keep in mind that I'm not entirely sure if this is as common in the Mexican-US border as it is in the US-Canada border, which is that there are a lot of people who live on one side of the border, so they either live in Canada or the US, and they work on the other side of the border. So their regular commute is crossing the border twice a day.
Yeah.
And those people, a lot of them have Nexus, which is basically like a fast pass that gets you through across the border, whether that's, by car or on foot, but typically by car. And that means you are the perfect candidate to traffic for us because you have this Nexus pass too. I think it's valid for 10 years once you get accepted. And you can just basically go freely in a way. And for a lot of those people, those are what I was told and what I saw. Those are a lot of people that are trafficking it in the car panels, in the truck beds, that are regular border crossers that even perhaps could say, hey, good morning to the CBS officer, the Border Patrol agent, as they go through by name. And they're making an extra couple thousand dollars. And it's housewives, it's, working class people, just someone you would perhaps never expect, who now, especially because of the state of the economy, got offered this because, oh, my niece's best friend is dating this Mexican guy who told me I could make an extra $4,000. Certainly, of course you do it.
So that's very interesting. So basically, people just go right through with a pass. They're not being checked. Now, so it seems highly likely, and we've got this from source. We've got it from a Sinaloa cartel source, got this from a good source in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who are saying we're seeing a lot of Mexican cartel activity here and moving dope to the United States. So in this sense, Donald Trump had a point. I don't know if he got this from, people inside, DEA or people inside.
He got it from my report.
Yeah, who knew about this. Yeah, reading the stuff there. Now, this is, it's interesting. We're interested in getting the story here, wherever it goes politically.
Yeah, we don't care.
I'm not like, I'm independent. I'm not,
Me too.
And so but in this story, what would you say the reaction was politically from when you start, coming up and saying, no, there is a bunch of dope going from Canada to the United States? Did you get kickback from people in Canada? You're playing to Trump's hand. What was the kind of reaction you were seeing to this reporting?
Anytime we talk about this, people will think that we're playing into Trump's hand. But that's not we have an agenda, and that's certainly not the case. It's reporting what's happening, right? From a lot of Canadian people, especially people who live along the border, it was a lot of positive feedback. It was like, I've been seeing this, and what the fuck, and finally someone's talking about this. Yeah, look at what Katarina's saying, because this is true. And even from drug users or drug dealers, they're like, yeah, we're working with the Mexicans. Like, this is a new thing, you know? And especially a lot of people from African descent who go to the West Coast from the East Coast of Canada, they were saying, yeah, like, we're working with the Mexicans a lot, you know, and we're going to certain apartments and picking up stuff from them, and they're not even speaking to us in English. So it's just kind of a handover. Certainly, what I think is interesting is that the Canadian government will say, no, less than 1% is coming from us. You know, one of a high up from Trudeau's political circle, after he resigned, came out to say, Mexican cartels are operating in Canada. This was just a few weeks ago, way after I did this report. And for a lot of people, it was like, holy shit. And for me, it was like, yeah, duh, I told you. And so that was really interesting, because at the same time, the Canadian government won't come out and say it, but then there is that crackdown that's happening.
Well, they announced in response to Trump's pressure and the threat of tariffs, they created a fentanyl czar.
What I find most interesting about this is that Trump's pressure is what caused them to put someone into a fentanyl czar position, not the hundreds of thousands of overdose deaths that have been happening for the last couple of years.
Yeah, that's such a great point. I mean, it's kind of amazed me with the fentanyl crisis in the United States, how little a lot of the politicians really responded to it for a lot of years when you had this amount of people dying. And we've seen the same in Canada, like basically poor people dying particularly, but I mean, not only poor people, because it really crosses...
Drugs do not discriminate. Addiction doesn't discriminate. It's like diabetes.
Yeah, and with fentanyl so lethal to just kind of human beings, how much just like the system doesn't respond to human beings' needs. You know, what is it, you know, what really makes them care about this issue? And people said, oh, you know, the crack epidemic in the 80s. The crack epidemic in the 80s, there was like yearly deaths of things like 4,000 in the United States. And in the current opioid epidemic, more than 100,000 a year.
It's like 4,000 a month.
Yeah, you know, it's so crazy. So you get Canada responding to this. Now, one thing is, although Canada is responding, looking into this story made me kind of had a kind of wake up moment a bit. Like, okay, right now we have Mexico cracking down. We've seen in the first couple of months of the Sheinbaum administration a serious reduction in fentanyl coming through Mexico, according to Border Patrol figures.
Right.
So a drop of about 73%. So a significant
Yeah.
reduction. I do believe it. I believe that is being reduced because Trump pressures Mexico City. Mexico City pressures the cartels. The cartels pressure all the little naquillos in their territories, in their
Just
plazas.
like the guys I talked to in Tijuana.
Exactly.
And they said they're going to lay low for the 4 years.
Pressure coming down.
Yep.
So, or at least now. So we've got the fentanyl coming down. However, you know, we've got that option, and this gets back to the metaphor people use of the balloon for drug enforcement. If you squeeze the Mexico-US border, that air, because the profits in demand for the fentanyl, is okay, we'll go to Canada and walk it in.
100%. And this started in Trump's first administration, his first time as president. Now, I can only imagine what's going to happen, because cartels have also been preparing for this. I mean, the FTO designation, right? It was like, it's been this big story, but that FTO designation was first brought up years ago, in like 2021 or 2019? And then Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed his own designation calling them FTOs.
So just explain to some people, the FTO is a foreign terrorist
organization. The cartels have now been labeled by the United States and then now also Canada as foreign terrorist organizations.
Right, that's a good point to bring up. So okay, the US, this is the big part of their clampdown. First day in office, January 20th, Donald Trump signs an executive order, designate cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. About a month or so later, they named 6 Mexican cartels, plus Trinidad Agua and MS-13. But Canada also does it. Canada does it.
Canada follows suit. And then they put in the fentanyls. They also say that they're terrorist organizations. But what I find is interesting is then you look at the way that these people are getting charged. It's like with this case in Surrey. Okay, these they crack down on this house. They freeze this asset of these 3 guys who have direct connections with the Sinaloa cartel, but no one's getting a terrorist charge. And that to me is very interesting because I think for the Canadian government and for a lot of Canadians, they still, it's not the way Americans are viewing now cartels as terrorists. To Canadians, terrorists is still ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, right? Is that terrorist designation in Canada going to carry the same weight as that terrorist designation in the US? It's very hard to say. It's also important to keep in mind that a lot of the cartel affiliates and, family members or high-ups of these Mexican cartels are mainly residing and have these ghost companies in the US more than in Canada. Because in Canada, this is, in a sense, still something new, their presence there, right? Like, they captured El Mencho's son-in-law in Riverside, California, living in that $4 million house. You're not really going to see that in Canada, especially due to proximity. Those guys still have to be close to the home base, and Canada just doesn't allow for that.
Well, that's a very interesting point. It's like the terrorist designation, a lot of people saw this as this kind of magic wand.
Oh, for sure.
We call them terrorists.
They're going to,
and then we'll
special forces are going to come in.
But it's still like, okay, you call them terrorists, you change the name, you've designated them, but these guys are still operating, and you've got to, how do you break that down? How do you destroy their operations? So with the Mexicans getting into, you mentioned this earlier, but you're saying they get in there through tourist visas, through
student visas and refugee status.
Even refugee status.
And I know I have...
That's quite a controversial point there.
And let's talk about the refugee status. And not to make it controversial, because again, I'm not a political, totally nonpartisan, but I have names of certain guys, that a lot of law enforcement sources, or one good law enforcement source shared with me and that I've seen, who are working for the Sinaloa cartel and CJNG, who are on refugee status or living in Canada through refugee status and have gone to jail for either, having illicit substance for the purpose of selling or trafficking, domestic violence charges.
Would you lose your refugee status?
Nope.
If you
this
go to
is
prison
the
for
exact
drugs?
point.
Yeah, you don't.
This is the exact point, and they're still there, and they're living freely. And it's also important to keep in mind, and I don't want to get into all of this because it's certainly very murky, but the context of the way the judicial system works in Canada and how it's not what would you call it? Like it's very different than the United States in the terms of the way they crack down on people who have committed violent or non-violent crimes. You're not going to see a lot of jail time for most people.
Okay. It's generally a much more tolerant system than the United States, which is a much harsher system than Europe.
Yes.
It has a much higher number of prisons. So Canada has more of a European-style approach to criminal justice.
Canada has a very tolerant approach, and I wouldn't even compare it to Europe, because in a lot of these European countries that have a tolerant approach, they're really focused on rehabilitation and resources. Like, you'll see a lot of, like in the Netherlands, they have for violent sex offenders, they're going to really try to reform that person. In Canada, our resources don't reach that level. For a lot of these people, they're not going to reform, and they're going to be continuous offenders, no matter what the crime is. But you're not going to see them doing jail time. So
that makes another reason why Canada could be a kind of weak link in this. On that refugee point, I think, like the world is complicated.
For sure.
Discover after the years. And so, like, multiple things can be true at the same time. So you've got people from Mexico who are genuinely running for their lives, who are threatened by a cartel that works with the government, and they basically do have to get out of Mexico.
Totally.
They're going to be murdered. They go to the US or they go to Canada and they say, I'm a refugee, I want to ask for asylum. And generally they have a thing of, basically a genuine need that they're going to be murdered if they go back home. Whatever, there's discussions about this, but like that's a true case. On the same side, you've got people who could be taking advantage of that and going to Canada and saying, okay, I'm a refugee, but really I'm involved
criminal.
still with the cartel.
And the thing is, I see stories like this all the time, especially when I was a reporter in Canada, of this Mexican family of 3 is asking for the community's help because they're about to be sent back and their refugee status is not getting accepted. And those people were genuinely facing danger, and they're working normal jobs and totally legitimate family who are scared for their lives because they're from a small town where everyone's being extorted, and they're worried that their daughter is going to be extorted and raped and perhaps murdered. At the same time, in Nayarit, in Jalisco, in Michoacan, there's another state too. There are clandestine agencies operating that are helping these illicit people make their case for refugee status, so it's 100% gets accepted. It's like fail-proof, and they get to go over there and work for the cartels.
Is it? I mean, in the US, actually, right now there's a very high refusal rate of Mexicans, and Mexico's are one of the nationalities that are most commonly refused. Funny enough, Afghans, like it'll be like a kind of over 80% approval, and Mexicans is like a 13% approval.
Crazy.
Now, one of the lawyers in this told me that the reason is because partly they don't want the floodgate because Mexico's right next to the United States. If they gave a higher approval rate, they feel it would just like open the floodgates. But in Canada, is it a higher approval rate? It's easier to get refugee status in Canada than in the United States?
It's on a case-by-case basis, but I think that especially with the previous government that we're having an election coming soon. So I say previous government because the Canadian Prime Minister resigned. It was a fairly simple process for people to get refugee status, which is, I think, exactly the reason why, unfortunately, it took away the legitimacy from a lot of cases of people really needing it, and allowed other people in who should not have had refugee status and came in with a clandestine agenda and are living and thriving in Canada.
Now, also, you've got the issue where now the government requires a tourist visa for Mexicans, that you actually apply for a visa, whereas before you just arrive at the airport
and
with
you just pay like
visa
this
waiver.
It was like a electronic travel fee, something like that. I think it's called ETA. You just pay that, you can get in. You didn't have to apply and get a visa.
Which is obviously this pisses off a lot of people here in Mexico, because I know a lot of middle class Mexicans who want to go to Canada and they're used to going to Canada. And now they've got or also people with family in Canada.
Now you need a visa.
And now you need a visa. Now, I know in the UK, when they did this with Jamaicans, and it was directly linked to cocaine trafficking.
Okay.
You basically get like plane loads of people coming from Jamaica, and the police were saying that they'd find literally 10% of the passengers. So you'd have like 300 people on an aeroplane, 30 people
had coke
carrying cocaine.
Crazy.
So like they just bring it in. So after they said, like, we're going to ask for visas, and that really annoyed and inconvenienced a lot of regular Jamaican people. Do you know, was this one of the reasons why they started asking for visas for Mexicans?
Oh, certainly. And also because literally a report came out when they rescinded the visa in, I think, 2021. A report came out saying that there's more criminals coming from Mexico than before operating in illegal activity in Canada. And then, obviously, this exploded. And now we're seeing, Trump's crackdown, and we're seeing the cartel affiliates operating in Canada. And I think that was certainly why they put that visa restriction back in place. And that only happened basically exactly a year ago, February 2024, that they put that visa back into place.
So, Trump looks like he could be right in saying there's an issue of fentanyl coming from Canada they need to crack down on. At the same time, okay, he's threatening for whatever motives he has about tariffs, and he likes tariffs anyway. He wants to them anyway. He doesn't like the idea that Canada exports more things to the US than the US to Canada, and he's coming out with this thing saying, "Oh, it'd be really great to have a 51st state." Now, what's the reaction in Canada to this? I mean, they think it's serious that he wants to invade Canada, or is it just like bluster? And how are Canadians reacting to this?
Canadians are really pissed off about this. And from most of the rhetoric that I see on social media and from the community groups, they hate it. And of course, because it's pretty much attacking Canada's autonomy. It's funny because even, for me, because I'm always between Canada, US, and Mexico, everyone says, he's going for Mexico, but he's really going for Canada, because he's not calling Mexico 52nd state. He's only going for Canada, and Canadians are really pissed off about that. And, previous Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and a lot of politicians even really cracked down and, saying, boo the American national anthem at the hockey game, and this is our sport and this is our country. It really ignited this flame of nationalism in Canadians that didn't really exist to this extent before. People are not liking it. American products are basically completely boycotted in Canada. The poor liquor store workers, every time he puts the tariffs and takes them off, they're taking off the American alcohol, putting it back on, So Canadians aren't happy with this. I think any Canadians there's perhaps a few percentage of Canadians that are saying, yeah, sure, we'll be American, fuck yeah, but the vast majority are not happy with it, and they feel like it's a personal attack and on their national autonomy.
I mean, the reason he didn't say Mexico is because I think he could really imagine
Canada,
a North American, growing the United States.
And especially because Alaska is American.
Yeah, Alaska, Canada, Greenland.
For sure.
And expanding it. But he also realizes he doesn't want the issue of running Mexico. Because, that's the thing. There's fear about, there's genuine fear and genuine concern about that there could be US military strikes, incursions into Mexico.
Yeah, people are worried about that.
There's a concern, I think, maybe about creating a buffer zone. Maybe that could happen. They could push into Mexico a bit. But I don't think the United States wants to actually invade Mexico and own Mexico, because then, then you own all Mexico's problems.
Of course.
Whereas Canada, you could say, okay, that's a lot of territory. And because Trump's really a real estate guy, he just sees real estate.
And Canada's a beautiful real estate destination because we have smaller population than California, but we have so much land. Most of it is unoccupied. Well, a lot of it is inhabitable, right? And it's Arctic. So for him, yeah, just imagine a big Trump Tower right in the middle of the Arctic.
So yeah, I can see, it doesn't seem realistic that he's really going to do it. It just seems too out there.
For sure.
But maybe part of him I think he's kind of thinking about it. So crazy stuff. Last question about this. Where do you see this going? Do you think it's going to be a bigger issue now? People have suddenly realized now, okay, there's a northern border, there's drug trafficking there. Is it going to get bigger? Is it already a lot bigger than we know about? Where do you see this going?
It's certainly a lot bigger than what we think it is. And now there's this, crackdown. We're going to, crack down on any trafficking. We know that the Mexican drug cartels are operating in Canada. We have the fentanyl czar. I think this came a little too late because the operations are already in full flux over there. The people who need to be there are there. The connections have been made, whether that's with local gangs, with law enforcement, with people working at the port. So at this point, in order to end that would have had to happen 6 years ago, minimum. Because now that this is a business that has expanded into Canada, that is now full-fledged. So I can't see it really getting worse, particularly in these next 4 years. But I think perhaps once Trump is out of office, and there's more, maybe, I'm thinking hypothetically here, it's more lax again, it'll blow up again. And because all of those contacts have been made, that ground has been set in Canada, that's going to be their spot. That's just my theory. And it seems like it's working for them. It's working for the Mexican drug cartels to be in Canada. It's working for the local gangs to work with the Mexican drug cartels, because all of these groups, respectively, have had their international connections. So just imagine, all together, it's the fucking United Nations.
The fucking United Nations. Well, look, that's great stuff. You can check out Katerina's great story on this, and another story worked on Cartels reacting to the terrorist designation in Mexico, and a bunch of other great stuff on Crash Out, www.crashoutmedia.com. Also, where's the other best place to check you out, Katarina?
My Substack, Katarina Schultz Substack. Very simple. I'm tagged in the posts, so please go over there. I love the new subscribers from Crash Out.
Outro boom!